Happy Halloween. Leave now while you still can.
Leave now before Master finds you.
Who is that knocking at my door? Who is that knocking at my door? Who is that knocking at my door? Be gone with you.
Hello everyone, today's video I'll be talking about Dracula Prince of Darkness from 1966. In my opinion, this is the best Hammer Dracula sequel out of all the Hammer Dracula movies. Brides of Dracula was a sequel. This one is considered by Hammer fans to be more of a sequel than Brides of Dracula was. And that's probably because Christopher Lee was in this one and was absent in Brides of Dracula. It opens up with a recap reminding the audience what happened in Horror of Dracula when Van Helsing killed Dracula. Unlike Hammer Frankenstein series that were semi-reboots and semi-sequels, or Hammer could just not make up their minds what they wanted like each film to be, this one shows that follows a continuation of the story to Horror of Dracula, and Brides somewhat to a degree. Dracula Prince of Darkness was once again directed by Terence Fisher, but this was the last time he directed a Hammer Dracula movie. I guess because around this time he was also too busy with the Hammer Frankenstein movies and other Hammer films he directed. James Remar does the score again, and once again it's another great score. Back in 2020 when I reviewed this movie with my friend Christian on his YouTube channel talking about all the Hammer Dracula movies, he pointed out something that I agree with him about, how this movie has elements of the slasher genre before the slasher subgenre was popular. Dracula has no lines in this movie. It makes him a slasher villain type like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees. It also has elements of the old Dark House. A group of friends are on an adventure. They hear rumors about a haunted castle from villagers at a bar. The town villagers give them a warning not to go to that spooky castle. But like all dummies in horror movies, they don't listen and go on to Dracula's castle anyway, thinking it'll be a fun adventure, a new experience for us. The stagecoach drops them off halfway through the castle's destination and says, "I will pick you up tomorrow." Well, there won't be a tomorrow for these victims that Dracula kills in this movie. At first they want to turn back, but the stagecoach horses end up taking them to Dracula's castle. They lose their luggage, but somehow mysteriously unknown, the luggage ends up at the castle. This movie was made during the same time as Rescuing the Mad Monk by Hammer. They borrowed the same set designs from that movie and used them in this movie. The set designs of this movie are really cool and awesome. They look almost identical to the same set designs from Horror of Dracula, that medieval time feel to it. It was interesting to read how originally Christopher Lee was originally supposed to have dialogue as Dracula, but he refused to say the words. According to him, he hated what the producers and writers wrote for Dracula's original dialogue for this movie. But I don't know why, when I was rewatching this movie for this review, anytime Dracula appeared, when he's about to suck a victim's blood, I had this sense of what I was expecting to say something, but at the same time I kept reminding myself, Dracula has no dialogue in this movie. It was interesting to see Dracula have one of his victims drink his blood. I'd never seen that before in any Dracula movie that comes to mind. When I did my research on this movie, I watched the Choice Voice video. He said from his research that this scene was a metaphor for oral sex. Interesting theory, but for some reason I did not see it that way. Even with Christopher Lee not having dialogue as Dracula, he still does a good job through his body language. He is one crazy sexual predator in this movie, just like in the first movie. This is not a big minor complaint, but I will admit, despite the title, Dracula doesn't show up until 45 minutes into the movie. He's not in this movie that much as you expect. I respect and understand that the movie was focusing on a story and for character build-up. Father Sandor was an interesting character. He was basically the replacement for Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. But sometimes I wonder, did he know or meet Van Helsing or read about him? Again, very interesting character. He's like another type of character who's also very knowledgeable on vampires, just like Van Helsing, despite that he was not in the last two movies. I found him a little bit eccentric gruff at times, but he was still a likable character. Too bad they did not bring this character back if Peter Cushing was not coming back as Van Helsing in the later Dracula Hammer films. The actor who played Father Sandor, Andrew Kerr, was in one of the Hammer Quatermass movies, which I've heard about, but I've never seen any of those movies. I would like to check them out at some point in time. His intro of this movie is seeing him pay respect to someone who lost his daughter, but he had no choice but to kill her because she was a vampire. Sometimes I also wonder, with Peter Cushing absent in this movie, is because he was also busy playing Dr. Frankenstein, the Hammer Frankenstein movies, around the same time as the Hammer Dracula movies were being made. I guess Peter Cushing could not commit to doing both. We don't see Peter Cushing again as Van Helsing again until later in Dracula 80 1972. Even though I do love this movie, but I do miss Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. Clovis Dracula's servant who always prepares when guests arrive at the castle to honor his dead master. Dracula did not have a servant in Horror of Dracula, but then again, back then continuity did not mean anything to film studios. He looks a little bit identical to Ernest Thesiger from The Bride of Frankenstein and The Old Dark House. When the gang are all having dinner, they're making comments thinking that Dracula must have been a nice person. Oi, they have no idea what they're talking about. They need to read more books on vampires. They also don't know what this whole event was a setup and a trap. Clovis murders one of the guests to resurrect Dracula. Seeing him hang cut his body reminds me of something out of Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum. The resurrection transformation is pretty cool. Awesome special effects you don't see anymore. Very well done for 1966. Seeing this reminded me of Frank's resurrection scene in Hellraiser. Renfield's in this movie, but he only has a small part. He eats a fly, just like how Renfield Universal Dracula had an obsession for bugs. His name is Ludwig. When you're first introduced to him, he seemed harmless, quirky, and a gentleman. But when we see Dracula possess him, he shows how loyal he is to Dracula and will do whatever Dracula wants. Ludwig is a sleazeball when he invites Dracula inside the monk's home. The character Charles, who's the hero of the movie, is kind of a jerk, cocky, arrogant, immature, and had a little ego. He doesn't listen to the town villagers that Dracula's castle is dangerous, but later on he grows on you a little bit likable when he becomes heroic, teaming up with Father Sandor to fight Dracula and save his wife. He was played by Francis Matthews, who played Hans in Revenge of Frankenstein. The other characters are okay, they're nothing special, just basic, straightforward characters. Barbara Shelley, who plays Helen Kent, her character was the kind of person who was afraid, scared, and said something bad was going to happen. She was not a risk-taker. You could also say she was more of a recluse kind of character, not as adventurous or outgoing like her other friends were. She didn't want to go out to the castle, but I guess she wanted to try to get out of her comfort zone as best as possible. Everyone thinks she's being silly and too scared, but she had a reason for being afraid and scared. Her screams are very believable when she sees Dracula, but it seems like Dracula gets bored of her after a few minutes and wants Charles' wife instead. Once again, Dracula is never satisfied with any woman. You feel bad for when her husband Alan was killed by Clove to bring Dracula back from the dead. Her death was very horrific when Sandor stabs her, but at the same time it had to be done because she was a possessed vampire. In Horror of Dracula, he dies from sunlight. In this movie, they got creative how Dracula dies in this movie. He fights the hero on ice and he dies falling in the frozen ice. I never imagined water killing Dracula or any vampire, but then again, vampires hate holy water. But this was not holy water, it was just regular water. While Dracula Prince of Darkness may not be groundbreaking or special or top the first movie, it's still a fun movie to watch. It might have some flaws, but it's still an enjoyable movie to watch from start to finish and be invested in the story and characters. And it's nice to see Christopher Lee back as Dracula despite having no dialogue. Anytime I've gone back to rewatch this movie, it's still my favorite Hammer Dracula movie sequel. Tune in tomorrow for Dracula is Risen from the Grave. See you tomorrow.